or other pre-existing vocal music. Symphony No. 4. To see how Mahler incorporated an orchestral song into a symphony, let us consider the genesis of his Symphony No. 4, composed in 1889-1901. To provide a focal point and goal for the standard four-movement symphonic framework, Mahler returned to an art song that he had set for voice and piano back in 1892, titled Das himmlische Leben, from his WNDERHORN settings. Taking the original piano accompaniment, he arranged it for a large orchestra. The arrangement, now for voice and orchestra, was to serve as the final, valedictory movement. The task then was to fashion 3 brand new movements that would provide a fitting preface to the climactic finale. So Mahler wrote a lengthy first movement in sonata, allegro form, a scherzo that invokes the figure of the dancing devil of hell, and a double variation slow movement, all to precede the heavenly finale. Thus the spirit of the symphony expresses a play of opposites, hell and heaven, the demonic and the divine, the macabre and the beautiful. How do you depict heaven in music? Mahler moves through the 4 stanzas of the poem almost exclusively in the major, leading the listener through sonic space that is filled with airy melodies, dancing rhythms, light textures, and tinkling percussive sparkles. The most celestial sounds come in the final strophe, in which the composer paints the music of the angels. No music on earth can be compared with ours. For a Mahler-heavy experience, watch a portion of his Symphony No. 5 in the YouTube playlist at the text website. Figure 34. Mahler said, "The symphony is the world, it must embrace everything." This contemporary newspaper caricature suggests the various things that Maestro Mahler threw into symphonies: animal sounds, birdsong, church bells, and military music, among others. Copyright Imagno Getty Images. Gustav Mahler was an extraordinary composer whose greatness came to be recognized only during the second half of the 20th century. His vision of music, what it can express, is both internal and external, personally introspective yet outward-looking. "The symphony is the world, it must embrace everything," he once said. And so he tried to embrace every sort of music within it. At various points in his symphonies, we hear folk dances, popular songs, military marches, offstage bands, bugle calls, and even Gregorian chant, Fig. 30-4. These musical events, however, do not seem to come in a logical or narrative sequence. They do not tell a story. Instead, they sound in an apparently random order, one piling on top of another, creating a dreamlike music of the subconscious. Perhaps not coincidentally, Sigmund Freud and Mahler were acquaintances. For an example of Mahler heavy, download a supplementary listening guide for his Symphony No. 1, third movement, at the text website. At the same time, Mahler's collage of sound plays outwardly on the grandest scale, achieved, in part, by employing massive forces and a greatly extended sense of time. His Symphony No. 2, for example, calls for 10 horns and 8 trumpets, and lasts an hour and a half. And the first performance of his Symphony No. 8 in Munich in 1910 involved 858 singers and 171 instrumentalists. With good reason, it has been nicknamed the Symphony of 1,000. Thus our Symphony No. 4, requiring only 75 or so players, might be rightly termed Mahler Light, and is universally recognized as the most accessible of Mahler's 9 symphonies. Watch a video of Craig Wright's Open Yale Course Class Session 20, The Colossal Symphony, Beethoven, Berlioz, Mahler, and Shostakovich, at the text website. Gustav Mahler was the last in the long line of great German symphonists that extends back through Brahms, Schubert, and Beethoven to Mozart and, ultimately, to Haydn. What had begun as a modest instrumental genre with a limited emotional range had grown in the course of the 19th century into a monumental structure. It had become the equivalent, in Mahler's view, not only of the creator's mind, but also of the entire cosmos. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may watch Craig Wright's own lecture at Open Yale Courses and complete this chapter's listening exercise interactively, as well as view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. A complete checklist of musical style for the Romantic era can be found at the text website. Key words: absolute music, double stops, orchestral song. Part 6. Modern and art music, 1880, present. Musée Marmottan, Paris. Photo Peter Willy Superstock 31 Impressionism and Exoticism 32 Modernism in Music and the Arts 33 Early 20th Century Modernism 34 Russian and Eastern European Modernism 35 3 American Voices 36 Postmodernism. Human activity, artistic or otherwise, never occurs within tidy chronological units. Historical periods overlap, and different styles coexist in time. Setting the dates of modernism and postmodernism is a particularly difficult task. Until recently, historians have usually referred to modern music simply as 20th century music. But modern musical idioms appeared in some impressionist music of the late 19th century, while aspects of musical romanticism continue to exist even today. Similarly, postmodernism may have begun as early as the 1930s and continues to develop during our own times. Recognizing, then, that the terms modern and postmodern together connote a large, multifaceted musical period, what are a few of the characteristics that mark this epoch? At the beginning of the 20th century, composers increasingly turned against the warm sentimentality characteristic of much of 19th century music, replacing this romantic aesthetic with a harsh, percussive, impersonal sound. Melodies become more angular, and harmonies more dissonant. Simultaneously, the massive compositions of the late Romantic period, perhaps best represented by Gustav Mahler's Symphony of 1000, yield to smaller, less extravagant works. The abstract, impersonal quality of modern music is most clearly evident in Arnold Schoenberg's rigid 12-tone music. In the 1960s, a reaction against the formalism of Schoenberg and his disciples contributed to the increasing popularity of musical postmodernism, which allowed for a diversity of musical genres, electronic music and chance music, for example, performed in unconventional ways. If modernism turned against traditional musical styles, postmodernism, which continues today, often dispenses entirely with conventional musical forms and processes. 31 Impressionism and Exoticism. Romantic music reached its peak during the late 19th century in the grandiose works of Wagner, Tchaikovsky, Brahms, and Mahler. But by 1900, this German-dominated musical empire had started to weaken. Some composers outside the mainstream of Romanticism challenged the validity of the predominantly German style, epitomized by the music of Wagner. Not surprisingly, the most powerful anti-German sentiment was felt in France. Having first embraced Wagner's music during the 1870s and 1880s, the French avant-garde had, by the 1890s, turned against it. The French began to ridicule the sentimentality of Romanticism in general and the grandiose structures of the Germans in particular. German music was said to be too heavy, too pretentious, and too bombastic, like one of Wagner's Nordic giants. Meaningful expression, it was believed, might be communicated in more subtle ways, in something other than sheer volume of sound and epic length. Figure 31, 1. The painting that gave its name to an epoch, Claude Monet's Impression, Sunrise, was exhibited at the first group exhibition organized by Monet, Renoir, Degas, and Pissarro in Paris in 1874. The ships, rowboats, and other elements in the early morning light are more suggested than fully rendered. Said the critic Louis Leroy derisively of this painting at the time, wallpaper in its most embryonic state is more finished than that seascape. Musée Marmottan, Paris. Photo Peter Willy Superstock. Impressionism in Painting and Messiot. The movement that arose in France in opposition to German Romantic music has been given the name Impressionism. We are, of course, more familiar with this term as a designation for a school of late 19th century painters working in and around Paris, including Claude Monet, Auguste Renoir, Edgar Degas, Camille Pissarro, and the American Mary Cassatt. Impressionist painters were not overtly anti-German like their musical counterparts. There was no need to be, because the well-established tradition of French painting was widely considered superior to the German one. Instead, Monet and his colleagues rebelled against the traditional academic style of their native France. When the French Academy of Fine Arts refused to allow the progressive painters to show their canvases at the official salon in the early 1870s, they mounted their own exhibition. In the uproar that followed, the artists were disparagingly called Impressionists for the seemingly imprecise quality of their art. The painters accepted the name, partly as an act of defiance against the establishment, and soon the term was universally adopted. It is ironic that French Impressionism, which once generated such controversy, is now the most popular of all artistic styles. Indeed, judging by museum attendance and reproductions sold, there is an almost limitless enthusiasm for the art of Monet, Degas, Renoir, and their associates, precisely the paintings that the artists' contemporaries mocked and jeered. But what is it about the Impressionist style that initially caused such a furor? The Impressionists were the first to reject photographic realism in painting. Instead, they tried to recreate the impression that an object produced upon the senses in a single, fleeting moment. The key here is light. The Impressionists saw the world as awash in vibrant rays of light and sought to capture the aura that light-bathed objects created in the eyes of the beholder. To accomplish this, they covered their canvases with small, dab-like brushstrokes in which light was broken down into spots of color, thereby creating a sense of movement and fluidity. Shapes are not clearly defined but blurred, more suggested than delineated. Minor details disappear. Sunlight is everywhere and everything shimmers. Figure 31, 2. Claude Monet, Woman with Umbrella. The Impressionist canvas is not a finished surface in the traditional sense. Rather, the painter breaks down light into separate dabs of color and juxtaposes them for the viewer's eye to reassemble. Here bold brushstrokes convey an astonishing sense of movement, freshness, and sparkling light. Giraudon the Bridgeman Art Library. As impressions and sensations became paramount for these painters, not surprisingly, they showed an intensified interest in music. What art form is more elusive and suggestive? What medium allows the receiver, the listener, more freedom to interpret the sensations he or she perceives? Painters began to speak in musical terms. Paul Gauguin referred to the harmonies of line and color as the music of painting, and Vincent van Gogh suggested using color as the music of tones. Paul Cézanne painted an overture in homage to Wagner, while James Whistler, an American who worked in Paris in the 1860s and 1880s, created nocturnes and symphonies. The painters envied the musicians' good fortune to work in a medium that changes continually, rather than one that required the artist to seize the moment and fix it on canvas. For their part, musicians found inspiration in the visual arts. Claude Debussy, whose work most consistently displayed the Impressionist style in music, was delighted to be grouped with the Impressionist painters. "You do me great honor by calling me a pupil of Claude Monet," he told a friend in 1916. Debussy gave various collections of his compositions such artistic titles as sketches, images, and prints. Rare are the moments in history when the aesthetic aims of painters and musicians were as closely allied. Figure 31, 3. Claude Debussy at the age of 24. Giraudon the Bridgeman Art Library. Claude Debussy. Debussy was born in 1862 into a modest family living in a small town outside Paris. Since neither of his parents was musical, it came as a surprise when their son demonstrated talent at the keyboard. At the age of 10, he was sent to the Paris Conservatory for lessons in piano, composition, and music theory. Owing to his skill as a performer, he was soon engaged for summer work in the household of Nadezhda von Meck, a wealthy patroness of the arts and the principal supporter of Tchaikovsky, see Fig. 24-6, this employment took him, in turn, to Italy, Russia, and Vienna. In 1884, he won the Prix de Rome, an official prize in composition funded by the French government, one that required a 3-year stay in Rome. But Debussy was not happy in the Eternal City. He preferred Paris with its bistros, cafes, and bohemian ambience. Watch a video of Craig Wright's Open Yale Course Class Session 21, Musical Impressionism and Exoticism, Debussy, Ravel, and Monet, at the text website. Returning to Paris more or less permanently in 1887, the young Frenchman continued to study his craft and to search for his own independent voice as a composer. He had some minor successes, and yet, as he said in 1893, "There are still things that I am not able to do, create masterpieces, for example." But the next year, in 1894, he did just that. With the completion of Prélude à l'après-midi d'un faun, he gave to the public what has become his most enduring orchestral work. Debussy's later compositions, including his opera Pelléas et Mélisande, the symphonic poem La Mer, and his two books of preludes for piano, met with less popular favor. Critics complained that Debussy's works were lacking in form, melody, and forward motion. Today, in hindsight, we see in these works the beginnings of modernism. Debussy hated what he called the German developmental agenda and wrote no symphonies. He replaced the warm strings and heavy low brasses of the Romantic orchestra with a variety of woodwinds, which often dominate his textures. He began to separate color from line and then to luxuriate in color alone. Illness and the outbreak of World War I in 1914 brought Debussy's innovations to a halt. He died of cancer in the spring of 1918 while the guns of the German army were shelling Paris from the north. Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. Debussy spent more of his time in the company of poets and painters than musicians. His orchestral prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, in fact, was written to precede a stage reading of the poem The Afternoon of a Faun by his friend and mentor Stéphane Mallarmé. Mallarmé was the spiritual leader of a group of versifiers in FNDE, SIACLE Paris called the Symbolists, poets whose aesthetic aims were in harmony with those of the Impressionist painters. They worked to create a poetic style in which the literal meaning of the word was less important than its sound and the associations that that sound might produce. Said Mallarmé, to name an object is to destroy its poetic enjoyment, the aim is to suggest the object. Figure 31, 4. The poet Stéphane Mallarmé, author of The Afternoon of a Faun, as painted by the great predecessor of the Impressionists, Edouard Manet. Mallarmé was a friend and artistic mentor of the composer Debussy. Copyright Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. Symbolism is certainly at the heart of Mallarmé's evocative The Afternoon of a Faun, which applies suggestive language to an ancient Greek theme. The faun of Mallarmé's poem is not a young deer but a satyr, who spends his days in lustful pursuit of the nymphs of the forest. On this afternoon, we see the faun, exhausted from the morning's escapades, reclining on the forest floor in the still air of the midday heat. He contemplates future conquests while blowing listlessly on his panpipes. The following passage suggests the dreamlike mood, vague and elusive, that Debussy sought to recreate in his musical setting. No murmur of water in the woodland scene, bathed only in the sounds of my flute. And the only breeze, except for my two pipes, blows itself empty long before it can scatter the sound in an arid rain. On a horizon unmoved by a ripple this sound, visible and serene, mounts to the heavens, an inspired wisp. Debussy, who did not compose linear, narrative programmatic music in the tradition of Berlioz or Tchaikovsky, made no effort to follow Mallarmé's poem closely. As he said at the time of the first performance in December 1894, my prelude is really a sequence of mood paintings, throughout which the desire and dreams of the faun move in the heat of the midday sun. When Mallarmé heard the music, he, in turn, said the following about Debussy's musical response to the poem: "I never expected anything like it. The music prolongs the emotion of my poem and paints its scenery more passionately than colors could." Figure 31, 5. Mallarmé's The Afternoon of a Faun created something of a sensation among late 19th century artists. This painting by Paul Signy-Imers is just one of several such representations of the faun and woodland nymphs. Notice that he holds classical panpipes, which Debussy transformed into the sound of the flute. Hungarian National Gallery, Budapest. Copyright the Bridgman Art Library. Significantly, both musician and poet refer to Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun in terms of painting. But how does one create a painting in music? Here a tableau is depicted by using the distinctive colors of the instruments, especially the woodwinds, to evoke vibrant moods and sensations. The flute has one timbre, the oboe another, and the clarinet yet a third. Debussy has said, in effect, let us focus on the sound-producing capacity of the instruments, let us see what new shades can be elicited from them, let us try new registers, let us try new combinations. Thus a solo flute begins in its lowest register, followed by a harp glissando, then dabs of color from the French horn. These tonal impressions swirl, dissolve, and form again, but seem not to progress. As with the poetic language of the symbolists, in Debussy's musical syntax, units of meaning can come irregularly. There are no repeating rhythms or clear meters to push the music forward. All is languid beauty, a music that is utterly original and shockingly sensual. Listening exercise 38. Debussy. Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. 5-4, 6. 2-15, 17. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. Debussy, as we have seen, was a master of generating new sonorities, as well as creating new, discontinuous orchestrations. The following questions, therefore, pertain mainly to issues of color and orchestration. 1. Which of the following is true about the beginning of this piece? A. The texture is monophonic, the meter is vague, and the melody has chromaticism. B. The texture is polyphonic, the meter is clear, and the melody has chromaticism. C. The texture is homophonic, the meter is clear, and the melody does not have chromaticism. 2. The flute returns with the opening line, but now the strings quietly shimmer behind it. Which string technique creates this shimmering effect? A. Pizzicato. B. Obbligato. C. Tremolo. 3. By repeating a motive as it fades away, Debussy avoids any large climax of the sort beloved by romantic composers. In restating this motive continuously, on the same pitches, Debussy is employing what? A. A walking bass. B. An ostinato. C. An arpeggio. 4. Which dynamic marking does Debussy use to create this feeling of evasion and anticlimax? A. Crescendo, diminuendo. B. Diminuendo, crescendo. 5. When the flute returns with the twisting chromatic line, which instrument provides a colorful background? A. English horn. B. French horn. C. Harp. 6. Which is a correct description of the music at this point? A. The violins sweep forward with a sensuous melody based on a whole tone scale. B. Various instruments dart in and out with tiny motives, creating colorful sonorities but a discontinuous texture. 7. In this beautiful passage, Debussy comes closest to recreating the lush sentimentality more typical of Romantic than Impressionist music. Which statement is not correct? A. There is a solo for French horn and then violin at the beginning. B. There is a long, sweeping, rhythmically free melody. C. The melody is played expressively by the violins. 8. A passage with a prominent flute is stated and then repeated at a lower pitch, now featuring an oboe. What happens to the texture and orchestration in the course of each of these two passages? A. Polyphonic texture and discontinuous orchestration give way to homophonic texture and unchanging orchestration. B. Homophonic texture and unchanging orchestration give way to polyphonic texture and discontinuous orchestration. 9. In a typical orchestral work of the classical or Romantic periods, it is usually the violins that present most themes. In Debussy's Impressionist prelude, however, the instruments of which family introduce most melodic motives? A. Strings. B. Brasses. C. Woodwinds. D. Percussion. 10. Between 1870 and 1939 France and Germany went to war 3 times, and Debussy died in the middle one of these 3 engagements. The emotional effect of his prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun is to turn you into what? A. An aggressive, charging warrior. B. An enervated pacifist. Debussy's voluptuous prelude creates an entirely new world of musical aesthetics, one very different from the German Romantic school of Mendelssohn, Wagner, and Brahms. Where a composer in the German Romantic tradition asserts a strongly profiled theme, a French impressionist like Debussy instead insinuates a tiny motive. In place of clear meters and regular rhythms, the impressionist favors constantly shifting accents that obscure the pulse. Rather than working toward a thunderous climax and a strong cadence, the impressionist prefers to avoid a climax by placing a diminuendo before the cadence, thereby creating an anticlimax. Instead of marching purposefully along a well-directed harmonic progression, the impressionist chooses to sit on a single static harmony and let the colorful instruments work their magic. Most important, instead of using musical color to reinforce the musical theme, the impressionist prefers to call on the instruments to demonstrate their sonorities independent of theme. In the music of Debussy and the Impressionists, then, beautiful sonorities are allowed simply to exist, without having to progress thematically to some distant goal. All this was radically modern. Think back to the orchestral music of Beethoven, Brahms, and Tchaikovsky. In these earlier works, new themes are generally introduced by a new instrument or group of instruments. Instrumental color thus reinforces and gives profile to the theme. With Debussy, on the other hand, instruments enter with a distinct color but with no easily discernible theme. Thus, color and texture begin to replace melody as the primary agents in the creation of musical form. Debussy's approach was adopted by the revolutionary figures of 20th-century music, among them Charles Ives, Edgar Varese, and John Cage, who often generate musical form through colors and textures, rather than through thematic development. Not coincidentally, during the peak of Debussy's career, the Impressionist painters began to separate color from line as well. Figure 31, 6. In Edgar Degas's Combing of the Hair, the lines of the objects are sometimes only vaguely sketched, and the intense orange color runs beyond the boundaries of the lines. The intensity of color is now a prime emotive force in art, a hallmark of the new modernist style. Copyright National Gallery, London. The Bridgeman Art Library. Preludes for Piano. Debussy's last and most far-reaching attempt at descriptive writing in music is found in the two books of Preludes for Piano that he published in 1910 and 1913. Here the challenge to create musical impressions was all the greater, for the piano has a more limited musical palette than the multicolor orchestra. The evocative titles of some of these short pieces allude to their mysterious qualities: Steps in the Snow, The Sunken Cathedral, What the West Wind Saw, and Sounds and Perfumes Swirl in the Night Air. Download supplementary listening guides for Debussy's Nuages, from Nocturnes, and La Cathédrale Inglaudi, from Preludes, at the text website. Voiles, from the first book of Preludes of 1910, takes us to the sea. As we hear a fluid descent, mostly in parallel motion, we imagine sails flapping listlessly in the breeze. The hazy, languid atmosphere is created in part by the special scale Debussy employs, the whole tone scale, one in which all the pitches are a whole step apart. Example 31, one whole tone scale. Because in the whole tone scale each note is the same distance from its neighbor, no one pitch is heard as the tonal center, all pitches seem equally important. The composer can stop on any note of the scale, and it will sound no more central, or final, than any other note. The music floats without a tonal anchor. Then, as if impelled by a puff of wind, the boats seem to rock on the now rippling waters. Debussy creates this gentle rocking sensation by inserting a four-note ostinato into the texture. Frequently employed by Impressionist composers, ostinatos help account for the often static, restful feeling in the harmony. By definition, ostinatos involve repetition and inertia rather than dramatic movement. Figure 31, 7. Claude Monet's Sailboats. The rocking of the boats is suggested by the exaggerated reflections on the water. Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. Example 31, 2 ostinato. A new ostinato now appears in the upper register, while a succession of four-note chord sounds in the middle register. Notice that all four notes of each chord consistently move in what is called parallel motion. In parallel motion, all parts move together, locked in step, in the same direction. Example 31, 3 Parallel motion. Parallel motion is the antithesis of counterpoint, the traditional musical technique in which two or more lines usually move in directions opposite to one another. Parallel motion was an innovation of Debussy, and it was one way he expressed his opposition to the German school of Wagner and Brahms, so heavily steeped in counterpoint. Suddenly, a gust of wind seems to shake the ships as the pianist races up the scale in a harp-like glissando. This scale, however, is different from the preceding whole tone one. It is a pentatonic scale. There are only 5 notes within each octave, here the 5 notes corresponding to the black keys on the piano. We have seen before that the pentatonic scale is often found in folk music. Debussy first encountered it in the Southeast Asian music he heard at the Paris World's Fair of 1889. Exotic influences on the Impressionists. At the turn of the 20th century, Paris was the cultural capital of the Western world, and its citizens were eager to turn their eyes and ears to the East. In 1889, the French government sponsored an exposition universelle that featured Far Eastern art. It was here that painter Paul Gauguin first became enamored with the tropical colors of the Pacific. Claude Debussy, too, made several visits. Not only did he see the newly completed Eiffel Tower and newfangled inventions like electric lighting and electric-powered elevators, he also heard for the first time the exotic sounds of the Far East. Colonial governments including those of Cambodia, Vietnam, and Indonesia had sent small ensembles of instrumentalists, singers, and dancers to perform in newly constructed pavilions. The Cambodian pagoda seems to have been the inspiration for a later piano piece called Pagodas. Debussy also heard there a colorful gamelan orchestra from Indonesia, as he recalled to a friend some years later, "Do you not remember the Javanese?" Music that was capable of expressing every nuance of meaning, even unmentionable shades. And makes our tonic and dominant sounds seem weak and empty. This experience encouraged Debussy to incorporate in his own music and shimmering surfaces. It also suggested to him that the sounds of the East, ostinatos, static harmonies, pentamusic did not always have to progress toward a goal, tonic and whole tone scales, delicately layered textures. Instead, it might simply exist for the moment. The Cambodian pagoda at the World's Fair in Paris in 1889. Here Debussy heard the music of Cambodia, China, Vietnam, and Indonesia, and began to formulate a musical aesthetic different from the prevailing German symphonic tradition. Copyright Alinari archives the image works. Example 31, 4 Pentatonic scale. Following this energized whirl around the pentatonic scale, the seascape regains its placid demeanor with the return of the whole tone scale and, ultimately, the descending parallel thirds with which the piece began. At the end, Debussy directs the pianist to push down and hold the sustaining pedal. Once the sustaining pedal is pressed and held, all notes sounded thereafter will blur into a vague haze, similar to the hazes and mists that envelop many Impressionist paintings. Exoticism in music. One of the magical qualities of music is its capacity to transport us to distant lands. Far-off places can be experienced in our minds, if only through the strange and mysterious sounds we associate with them. Composers at the turn of the 20th century delighted in such vicarious journeys, and their music is brimming with the exotic. Claude Debussy was strongly influenced by the art of the Far East, and so, too, were the famous painters of the time. Impressionist Claude Monet lined the walls of his home in Giverny, France, not with his own canvases, but with prints and watercolors from Japan. Their influence can be seen in the startling portrait of his wife in traditional Japanese costume. Modernists like Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque began collecting African art in Paris during the years 1905-1908. Some historians believe that the Cubist movement in painting was born of Picasso's interest in African sculpture and ceremonial masks. Figure 31, 8. Claude Monet, La Japonaise. Europe and America began to show an enthusiasm for things Japanese after the opening of trade with Japan in the 1850s. fashionable Parisian women wore kimonos and furnished their homes with oriental furniture, prints, and objets d'art. Interphoto Alami. But what was the exotic in music? Briefly, musical exoticism was communicated by any sounds drawn from outside the traditional Western European musical experience. It might be a non-Western scale, a folk rhythm, or a musical instrument, like the tambourine or gong, that signified the exotic. It might also be an alien subject matter. Giacomo Puccini fashioned operas using stories set in Japan, China, and even the American West. For the French Impressionists like Claude Debussy and Maurice Ravel, nearby Spain was thought to be exotic. Debussy composed an orchestral piece and a piano work using Spanish melodies. Ravel wrote his first orchestral work and his last ballet, as well as an opera, on Spanish subjects. Yet neither Debussy nor Ravel ever set foot in Spain. In art, the evocative powers of the imagination are often a more potent force than mundane reality. Maurice Ravel. He was the eternal traveler who never went there, said an acquaintance of Maurice Ravel. Indeed, Ravel spent almost all of his life in Paris, an unassuming music teacher and composer earning a modest living. Only through his music did he journey to Spain, Arabia, Greece, and the Far East, all lands he sought to evoke through exotic-sounding elements in his music. Yet there was one exception to Ravel's life of the imagination. In 1928, he embarked on a 4-month concert tour of the United States. He heard jazz in Harlem with the American composer George Gershwin and had breakfast in Hollywood with Charlie Chaplin. He visited Niagara Falls and the Grand Canyon. Having performed and conducted his music in 25 American cities, Ravel returned to Paris with what was then the enormous sum of $27,000. In those days, even classical musicians, like pop singers today, could go on lucrative concert tours. It was fortunate for Ravel that he acquired this financial security, for his mental powers soon declined, and he died of Alzheimer's disease in Paris in 1937. Download a supplementary listening guide for Ravel's Bolero and Concerto for Piano and Orchestra in G major, at the text website. Rhapsody Espagnole. Ravel's first composition, written in 1895 at the age of 20, was a work for piano titled Habanera. A habanera, as we have seen, is a slow, seductive dance named after Havana, the capital of the then Spanish colony of Cuba. The rhythms that mark its progress are, however, West African, a musical legacy of the slave trade to Cuba. In 1907, Ravel arranged his habanera for orchestra and added 3 additional pieces to it to form his 4-movement Rhapsody Espagnole. Musical elements of the exotic include the habanera rhythm, as well as the presence of a tambourine, a small drum with jingles around its rim, from the Basque country. As you first listen to habanera, you might feel you are witnessing the seductive dance through a screen or filter. It all sounds distant and hazy. There are gossamer glissandos, hints of themes rather than distinct melodies, and lines moving in parallel motion. This is exotic Spain, filtered through the musical sensibilities of a French impressionist. Download a supplementary listening guide for Ravel's Prelude to the Night, the first movement of Rhapsody Espagnole, at the text website. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may watch Craig Wright's own lecture at Open Yale Courses and complete this chapter's listening exercise interactively, as well as view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words: Impressionism, symbolists, whole tone, scale, parallel motion, exoticism, tambourine. 32 Modernism in music in and the arts. The 20th century might best be called the age of extremes. On the one hand, the era was marked by unspeakable tragedies, including 2 world wars, the systematic extermination of millions of people, the use of chemical, biological, and atomic weapons, and brutal acts of terrorism. On the other hand, scientific advances significantly improved both the quality and length of human life. Such medical advances as antibiotics, organ transplants, and vaccines have saved countless lives. The automobile and airplane profoundly changed the way we travel, offering quick access to virtually the whole world. And important technological innovations, first radio and television, then computers and the internet, have revolutionized the dissemination of information. Technological progress has also affected our musical culture. The 20th century saw steady advances in recording and playback technology, with the respective inventions of the LP record, magnetic tape, compact disc, and MP3 file, which have made popular and classical music alike available to ever larger segments of the population. These advances, however, have not come without a cost, arguably having discouraged musical education and music making in the home. Why learn to play an instrument, one might wonder, when you can much more easily hear music on a computer or iPod? Modernism, an anti-romantic modernist. The first half of the 20th century was a particularly horrific time. In World War I, 9 million soldiers were killed on the battlefields. Shocked by the carnage, intellectuals turned away from the predominantly idealistic, sentimental aesthetics of Romanticism. How could one think of love and beauty in the face of wholesale destruction? For writers, painters, and composers alike, disjunction, anxiety, and even hysteria became valid artistic sentiments that reflected the realities of the day. Musicians of the early 20th century did not ignore the traditions of classical music. They retained, for example, the genres of opera, ballet, symphony, concerto, and string quartet. The most progressive composers, however, radically transformed the elements of expression within these genres, creating new kinds of melody, harmony, rhythm, and tone color. Radical experimentation in music began quietly enough in the music of the Impressionists, specifically in Claude Debussy's early separation of color from line. But as World War I approached, a crescendo of protest could be heard in the music of the avant-garde. The progressives renounced the notion that music should be beautiful, pleasing, and expressive, or that it should delight or comfort the listener. Instead, they resorted to distorting traditional musical practices, sometimes violently, with the intention of shocking audiences. Their compositions often achieved the intended effect. Arnold Schoenberg's early experiments with dissonance were received at first with hoots by a hostile public in Vienna in 1913, and Igor Stravinsky's dissonant chords and pounding rhythms caused a riot at the first performance of Le Sacre du Printemps in Paris that same year. Such avant-garde composers sought to shake their listeners out of a state of complacency, to yank them out of the romantic mists and back to harsh reality. Figure 32, 1. One of the first statements of Cubist art, Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. The ladies of the evening are depicted by means of geometric shapes on a flat, two-dimensional plane. Like much avant-garde music of the time, Cubist paintings reject the emotionalism and decorative appeal of 19th-century art. 2007 Estate of Pablo Picasso, Artists' Rights Society, New York Digital Image. Copyright the Museum of Modern Art, licensed by Scala Art Resource, New York. One can see clear parallels between the music and the visual art of this period. Early 20th century painters also introduced radical distortions into their works, similarly offending middle-class sensibilities. The increasingly angular melody and discontinuous rhythm of the new music found analogous expression in an artistic style called Cubism. In a Cubist painting, the artist fractures and dislocates formal reality into geometrical blocks and planes, as in the famous Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, created in 1907 by Pablo Picasso, where the female form has been recast into angular, interlocking shapes. Picasso seems to have found his musical counterpart in Stravinsky. The two friends admired each other's works and occasionally collaborated artistically. Schoenberg, a talented painter himself, found artistic camaraderie in the works of the German expressionist painters, who so distorted formal reality that objects in their paintings were sometimes barely recognizable. Just as traditional melody disappeared from early modernist music, so, too, the conventional figure vanished from avant-garde painting. Early 20th century musical style. The early 20th century was a period of stylistic diversity and conflict. During these years, Gustav Mahler continued to write his massive symphonies in a predominantly romantic idiom, while Claude Debussy composed in the Impressionist style, an early French forerunner of modernism. At the same time, the most progressive composers of art music turned to radical, indeed shocking, new ways of expressing melody, harmony, rhythm, and tone color. Figure 32, 2. The angularity and disjointed quality of much early 20th century melody can also be seen in contemporary painting. In Picasso's Three Musicians, for example, the figures are fractured and out of alignment. Compare the disjunct melody of Arnold Schoenberg given in example 32-1. 2007 Estate of Pablo Picasso, Artists' Rights Society, New York Museum of Modern Art, New York City, USA. Photo, AKG Berlin Superstock. Melody, more angularity and chromaticism. Unlike the melodies of the Romantic period, many of which are song-like in style and therefore easily sung and remembered, there are very few themes in 20th century music that the listener goes away humming. In fact, melody per se is less important to the avant-garde composer than is a pulsating rhythm, an unusual texture, or a new sonority. If Romantic melody is generally smooth, diatonic, and conjunct in motion, early 20th century melody tends to be fragmented, chromatic, and angular. The young avant-garde composers went to great lengths to avoid writing conjunct, stepwise lines. Rather than moving up a half step from C to D, for example, they were wont to jump down a major seventh to the D an octave below. Avoiding a simple interval for a more distant one an octave above or below is called octave displacement. It is a feature of modern music. So, too, is the heavy use of chromaticism. In the following example by Arnold Schoenberg, notice how the melody makes large leaps where it might more easily move by steps, and also how several sharps and flats are introduced to produce a highly chromatic line. Example 32, 1. Harmony, the emancipation of dissonance, new chords, new systems. Ever since the late Middle Ages, the basic building block of Western music had been the triad, a consonant, three-note chord. A composer might introduce dissonance for variety and tension, yet the rules of consonant harmony required that a dissonant pitch move immediately to a consonant one. During the late Romantic period, however, composers like Richard Wagner began to enrich their music with more and more chromaticism. By the first decade of the 20th century, composers such as Arnold Schoenberg were using so much dissonance that the triad had all but disappeared. Schoenberg famously referred to this development as the emancipation of dissonance, meaning that dissonance was now liberated from the requirement that it move to a consonance. At first, audiences rebelled when they heard Schoenberg's dissonance-filled scores, but the composer ultimately succeeded in raising the bar for what the ear might stand and preparing listeners for a much higher level of dissonance in both classical and popular music. Indeed, the work of Schoenberg and like-minded composers paved the way, albeit indirectly, for the heavy dissonances of today's progressive jazz and the dissonant metal styles of Metallica, Slipknot, and others. Early 20th century composers created dissonance not only by obscuring or distorting the traditional triad but also by introducing new chords. One technique for creating new chords was the superimposition of more thirds above the consonant triad. In this way were produced not only the seventh chord but also the ninth chord and the 11th chord. The more thirds that were added on top of the basic triad, the more dissonant the sound of the chord. Example 32, 2. The ultimate new chord was the tone cluster, the simultaneous sounding of a number of pitches only a whole step or a half step apart. Example 32-3 shows a tone cluster created by the American modernist Charles Ives. But you, too, can create this high dissonance chord simply by striking a group of adjacent keys on the piano with your fist or forearm. Try Wyatt. Example 32, three-tone cluster. Chromatic dissonance, new chords, and tone clusters all weaken the traditional role of tonality in music. Remember that triads had belonged to an interlocking system and that each moved progressively toward a tonic. As the triad disappeared, so, too, did the feeling of a key and the pull of a tonic. What were composers to do without triads, keys, and tonality, all of which had provided a structural framework for music? Simply said, they invented new systems to give structure to music. As we shall see, Igor Stravinsky anchored much of his music in long ostinatos, while Arnold Schoenberg invented an entirely new type of musical structure called the 12-tone method. Figure 32, 3. Lines of varying lengths can be seen as analogous to measures of different lengths caused by changing meters. Theo van Doesburg's Rhythms of a Russian Dance was surely inspired by the Russian sounds of Igor Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. Digital image. The Museum of Modern Art, licensed by Scala Art Resource, New York. Rhythm, new asymmetrical rhythms and irregular meters. Most art music before the 20th century, as well as most of our pop and rock music down to the present day, is built on regular patterns of duple, triple, or quadruple meter. Romantic music of the previous generation of composers had many qualities to recommend it: direct expression, broad themes, powerful climaxes, and moments of tender lyricism, to name several. But only rarely was romantic music carried along by an exciting, vital rhythm. Instead, it stayed within the comfortable confines of regular accents and duple or triple meter. At the turn of the 20th century, composers of art music began to rebel against the rhythmic and metric regularity that had governed most of 19th century music. Musicians such as Stravinsky and Bela Bartok began to write music in which syncopations and measures with odd numbers of beats made it all but impossible for the listener to feel regular metrical patterns. Accents moved from one pulse to another, and meters changed from measure to measure. In abandoning the traditional structures of regular rhythms and consistent meters, these composers mirrored the techniques of modern poets like Gertrude Stein and T.S. Eliot, who dispensed with traditional poetic meters and repeating accents in favor of free verse. Tone color, new sounds from new sources. 20th century composers created a brave new world of sound. This came about in large part because many musicians were dissatisfied with the string-dominated tone of the Romantic Symphony Orchestra. The string sound, with its lush vibrato, was thought to be too gentle, perhaps too mushy and sentimental, for the harsh realities of the modern world. So the strings, which had traditionally carried the melody, relinquished this role to the sharper, crisper woodwinds. Instead of playing a sweeping melody, the violinists might now be called on to beat on the string S with the wooden paw or T of the bow, or to take their hands and strike the instrument on its sound box. This preference for percussive effects over lyrical melody was also reflected in the new importance assigned the instruments of the percussion family. Entire pieces were written for percussion instruments alone. Instruments such as the xylophone, glockenspiel, and celesta were added to the group, and objects that produced an unfixed pitch, like the cowbell, brake drum, and police siren, were also heard on occasion. Finally, the piano, which in the Romantic era had been favored for its lyrical, singing, tone, came to be used as an orchestral instrument prized for the percussive way in which the hammers could be made to strike the strings. Introducing new instruments, or having traditional instruments make new sounds by means of novel playing techniques, was an important innovation. But a more radical development came about as composers began to think of musical color as a wholly independent expressive element. During the classical and romantic periods, sound S of different color S were used mainly as a way to demarcate themes, and thus to articulate the form of a composition. The second theme in sonata, allegro form, for example, was often assigned to a new instrument, thereby emphasizing for listeners that a new theme had entered. The use of tone color as a servant of melody came to an end at the turn of the 20th century, when Claude Debussy began to use color, independent of melody, to give form to a work. But Debussy's innovation was carried to radical lengths by later composers such as Charles Ives, Edgar Varese, and John Cage, whose work sometimes seemed to do nothing but progress from bright tones spaced far apart to dark tones densely grouped. These compositions may have no melody or harmony as traditionally conceived, but instead only clusters or streams of sounds with changing colors. This approach to color and line is, of course, similar to the one taken by avant-garde painters of the early 20th century, who deconstructed recognizable figures in order to emphasize the emotive power of pure color. The bold recognition that color alone can elicit a strong emotional response from the listener or viewer was arguably the most significant development in the history of early modern music and painting. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words: cubism, octave displacement, 7th chord, 9th chord, 11th chord tone cluster. Early 20th century modernism, 33. Among the composers of the early 20th century, no two had a greater influence on the course of Western musical history than Igor Stravinsky and Arnold Schoenberg. Each composed masterpieces still performed by orchestras today, and each had his own vision as to the direction modernist art should take. Schoenberg ultimately developed what is called the 12-tone system of composition, while Stravinsky, after perfecting flamboyant modernist ballet, moved on to a more restrained idiom called neoclassicism. Figure 33, 1. Igor Stravinsky. Copyright Mary Evans Picture Library. The Image Works. Igor Stravinsky. For 3/4 of the 20th century, Igor Stravinsky personified the cultural pluralism and stylistic diversity of cutting-edge art music. He created masterpieces in many different genres: opera, ballet, symphony, concerto, church mass, and cantata. His versatility was such that he could write a ballet for baby elephants just as easily as he could set to music a Greek classical drama. Throughout his long life, he traveled with the fashionable set of high art. Although reared in St. Petersburg, Russia, he later lived in Paris, Venice, Lausanne, New York, and Hollywood. Forced to become an expatriate by the Russian Revolution, he took French citizenship in 1934, and then, having moved to the United States at the outbreak of World War II, he became an American citizen in 1945. He counted among his friends the painter Pablo Picasso, the novelist Aldous Huxley, and the poet T. S. Eliot. On his 80th birthday, in 1962, he was honored by President John F. Kennedy at the White House and, later in the same year, by Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev in the Kremlin. He died in New York in 1971 at the age of 88. Figure 33, 2. Sergei Diaghilev in New York in 1916. Lebrek Music and Arts. Stravinsky rose to international fame as a composer of ballet music. In 1908, his early scores caught the attention of Sergei Diaghilev, the legendary impresario of Russian opera and ballet. Diaghilev wanted to bring modern Russian ballet to Paris, at that time the artistic capital of the world. So he formed a dance company, called the Ballets Russes, and hired, over the course of time, the most progressive artists he could find, Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse for scenic designs, and Claude Debussy, Maurice Ravel, and Stravinsky, among others, as composers. Stravinsky soon became the principal composer of the company, and the Ballets Russes became the focus of his musical activity for the next 10 years. Accordingly, the decade 1910-1920 has become known as Stravinsky's Russian ballet period. With the onset of World War I and the concurrent disappearance of large symphony orchestras in Europe, Stravinsky, along with others, developed a style called neoclassicism, which emphasized classical forms and smaller ensembles of the sort that had existed in the Baroque and Classical periods. Stravinsky's neoclassical period extended from 1920 until 1951, when he adopted the 12-tone technique of Arnold Schoenberg, which he continued to pursue until his death. Watch a video of Craig Wright's Open Yale Course Class Session 22, Modernism and Mahler, at the text website. Although Stravinsky's style continually evolved over the course of nearly 70 years, a recognizable Stravinsky sound is always evident. In simple terms, his music is lean, clean, and cool. Stravinsky's instrumental colors are not homogenized sounds, as when the winds and strings together join on a single line, but rather distinctly separate colors. While his orchestra is sometimes large, he downplays the warm strings, preferring instead the tones of piercing winds and brittle percussion. Thus, while his orchestral scores are often opulent, they are rarely lush or sentimental. Most important, rhythm is the vital element in Stravinsky's compositional style. His beat is strong, but often metrically irregular, and he builds complexity by requiring independent meters and rhythms to sound simultaneously. Many of these stylistic traits can be heard in his most famous work, The Rite of Spring, a watershed of early musical modernism. Figures 33.3 and 33.4. In 1909, Henri Matisse painted the first of two canvases titled Dance. Here he achieves a raw primitive power by exaggerating a few basic lines and employing a few cool tones. 2 years later, he created an even more intense vision of the same scene. In Dance, Matisse uses greater angularity and more intense colors, and thereby inspires a more intense reaction to this later version of a primitive dance scene. 2010 Succession H. Matisse Artists' Rights Society, New York Digital Image The Museum of Modern Art licensed by Scala Art Resource, New York. Copyright 2010 Succession H. Matisse Artists' Rights Society, New York Photo, Archives Henri Matisse. Le Sacre du Printemps. Igor Stravinsky composed 3 important early ballet scores for Diaghilev's dance company, The Firebird, Petrushka, and The Rite of Spring. All are built on Russian folk tales, a legacy of musical nationalism, and all make use of the large, colorful orchestra of the late 19th century. Yet the choreography for these Russian ballets is not the elegant, graceful ballet in the Romantic tradition, the sort that we associate with Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake and the Nutcracker. These are modern dances with angular poses and abrupt, jerky motions. To inspire this dance in the modern style, Stravinsky composed rhythms and chords that explode with a primordial force. Although The Rite of Spring has been called the great masterpiece of modern music, at its premiere it provoked not admiration but a riot of dissent. This premiere, the most notorious in the history of Western music, took place on an unusually hot evening, May 29, 1913, at the newly built Theatre Champs-Élysées in Paris. With the very first sounds of the orchestra, many in the packed theatre voiced, shouted, and hissed their displeasure. Some, feigning auditory pain, yelled for a doctor, others for 2. There were arguments and flying fists as opponents and partisans warred over this Russian brand of modern art. To restore calm, the curtain was lowered momentarily and the house lights were turned on and off. All in vain. The musicians still could not be heard, and consequently, the dancers had difficulty following the pulse of the music. The disorder was experienced firsthand by a visiting critic of the New York Press, who reported as follows. Download supplementary listening guides for the conclusion of Stravinsky, The Firebird, and Scene 1 from Petrushka at the text website. I was sitting in a box in which I had rented one seat. 3 ladies sat in front of me and a young man occupied the place behind me. He stood up during the course of the ballet to enable himself to see more clearly. The intense excitement under which he was laboring, thanks to the potent force of the music, betrayed itself presently when he began to beat rhythmically on the top of my head with his fists. My emotion was so great that I did not feel the blows for some time. They were perfectly synchronized with the beat of the music. In truth, the violent reaction to The Rite of Spring was in part a response to the modernist choreography, which sought to obliterate any trace of classical ballet. The dance was just as primitive as Stravinsky's musical score. But what aspects, specifically, of Stravinsky's music shocked so many in the audience that night? Percussive orchestra. First, there is a new percussive, one might say, heavy metal, approach to the orchestra. The percussion section is enlarged to include 4 timpani, a triangle, a tambourine, a gyro, cymbals, antique cymbals, a bass drum, and a tam-tam. Even the string family, the traditional provider of warmth and richness in the symphony orchestra, is required to play percussively, attacking the strings with repeated down bows at seemingly random moments of accent. Instead of warm, lush sounds, we hear bright, brittle, almost brutal ones pounded out by percussion, heavy woodwinds, and brasses. Irregular accents. Stravinsky intensifies the effect of his harsh, metallic sounds by placing them where they are not expected, on unaccented beats, thereby creating explosive syncopations. Notice in the following example, the famous beginning of Augurs of Spring, how the strings accent the second, fourth, and then first pulses of subsequent 4-pulse measures. In this way, Stravinsky destroys ordinary 1-2-3-4 meter and forces us to hear, in succession, groups of 4, 5, 2, 6, 3, 4, and 5 pulses, a conductor's nightmare. Example 33, 1. Polymeter. The rhythm of the rite of spring is complex because Stravinsky often superimposes 2 or more different meters simultaneously. Notice in example 33-2 that the oboe plays in time, the E clarinet plays in, while the B clarinet is in. This is an example of polymeter, 2 or more meters sounding simultaneously. Example 33-2. Polyrhythm. Not only do individual parts often play separate meters, but they also sometimes project 2 or more independent rhythms simultaneously. Look at the reduced score given in example 33-3. Every instrument seems to be doing its own thing. In fact, 6 distinct rhythms can be heard, offering a good example of polyrhythm, the simultaneous sounding of 2 or more rhythms. To see a demonstration of how various meters can be combined, watch Extreme Polymetric Ostinato Demonstration in the YouTube playlist on the text website. Example 33-3. Ostinato figures. Notice also in example 33-3 that most of the instruments play the same motive over and over at the same pitch level. Such a repeating figure, as we have seen, is called an ostinato. In this instance, we hear multiple ostinatos. Stravinsky was not the first 20th century composer to use ostinatos extensively. Debussy had done so earlier in his Impressionist scores. But Stravinsky employs them more often and for longer spans than did his predecessors. In the Rite of Spring, ostinatos give the music its incessant, driving quality, especially in the sections with fast tempos. Dissonant polychords. The harsh, biting sound that is heard throughout much of the Rite of Spring is often created by 2 triads, or a triad and a 7th chord sounding at once. What results is a polychord, the simultaneous sounding of one triad or 7th chord with another. When the individual chords of a polychord are only a whole step or a half step apart, the result is especially dissonant. In example 33-4, the passage from the beginning of Augurs of Spring, a 7th chord built on E is played simultaneously with a major triad built on F. Example 33-4. Download supplementary listening guides for Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, Part 1, Scenes 2 and 3, and Part 2, at the text website. The plot. The plot of The Rite of Spring is suggested by its subtitle, Pictures of Pagan Russia. Part 1, The Kiss of the Earth, depicts the springtime rituals of primitive Slavic tribes. In Part 2, The Sacrifice, a virgin dances herself to death as an offering to the god of spring. Before the curtain rises on Part 1, the orchestra plays an introduction. This music unfolds gradually but inexorably, from soft to loud, and from one line to many, suggesting the flora and fauna of the earth coming to life with the beginning of spring. The first scene, Augurs of Spring, features jarring, almost brutal accents and pounding dissonance. Yet there are also lyrical, almost sensuous moments in the score, especially when Stravinsky incorporates folk songs, whether quoting authentic Russian songs or composing his own melodies within this folk idiom. Despite the folkloric element, the bulk of the composition came from within. As Stravinsky declared, "I had only my ears to guide me. I heard and I wrote what I heard. I am the vessel through which the rite of spring passed." Figure 33-5. In his schemes of painting, the artist Albert Gleizes demonstrates that a cubist work can be created by rotating a figure or line against itself, and then again and again until visual dissonance results. Similarly, a polychord is created by placing 2 or more triads or 7th chords off-center and against one another, thereby creating musical dissonance. Listening exercise 39. Stravinsky The Rite of Spring. As you listen to the introduction of The Rite of Spring, you may be shocked by its dissonant, seemingly disorganized sound. You will find it difficult to identify a tonic pitch or a familiar scale that governs the music. To stabilize the music in the absence of a core tonality, Stravinsky employs several ostinatos. These ostinatos not only help hold the music together but also impart a feeling of kinetic energy, energy continually being recycled and renewed, like spring itself. The following exercise asks you to focus on the ostinatos in the introduction and scene 1. Hearing these ostinatos will not always be easy. Listen carefully to the inner parts. Are ostinatos present? Answer yes or no below. 5, 9, 10. 2, 18, 19. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Judging from your responses, are there more moments in the Rite of Spring that make use of an ostinato than those that do not? Following the success de scandale that attended the premiere of the Rite of Spring, Stravinsky extracted the music from the ballet itself and presented it as an independent orchestral suite. The music alone was now recognized as an important, if controversial, statement of the musical avant-garde. Later, in 1940, the score of the Rite of Spring furnished the music for an important segment of Walt Disney's early full-length animated film, Fantasia. For a brief moment, in Disney's Fantasia, musical modernism had become mainstream. Arnold Schoenberg and the Second Viennese School. Ironically, the most radical shoot of musical modernism took root in Vienna, a city with a long history of conservatism. In the early 20th century, a trio of native Viennese musicians, Arnold Schoenberg, Alban Berg, and Anton Webern, ventured to take high art music in a completely new direction. The close association of these three innovative composers has come to be called the Second Viennese School. Arnold Schoenberg, the leader of this group, almost single-handedly thrust musical modernism upon a reluctant Viennese public. Schoenberg was from a Jewish family of modest means and was largely self-taught as a musician. As a young man, he worked as a bank clerk during the day but studied literature, philosophy, and music at night, becoming a competent performer on the violin and cello. He came to know the music of Brahms, Wagner, and Mahler, mostly by playing their scores and attending concerts. Having left the world of bank notes for musical notes, at the age of 21, he earned a humble living by conducting a men's chorus, orchestrating operettas, the Viennese counterpart of our Broadway musicals, and giving lessons in music theory and composition. Eventually, his own compositions began to be heard in Vienna, though they were usually not well received. Schoenberg's earliest works are written in the late Romantic style, with rich harmonies, chromatic melodies, expansive forms, and programmatic content. But by 1908, his music had begun to evolve in unexpected directions. Strongly influenced by Wagner's chromatic melodies and harmonies, Schoenberg started to compose works with no tonal center. If Wagner could write winding chromatic passages that temporarily obscured the tonality, why not go one step further and create fully chromatic pieces in which there is no tonality? This Schoenberg did, and in so doing created what is called atonal music, music without tonality, without a key center. Download a supplementary listening guide for Schoenberg's A Survivor from Warsaw, at the text website. Schoenberg's contemporaries found his atonal music difficult. Not only was there no tonal center, but the melodies were highly disjunct, and the harmony exceedingly dissonant. Some performers refused to play his music, and when others did, audience reaction was occasionally violent. At one concert on March 31, 1913, the police had to be called in to restore order. Despite this hostility, Schoenberg remained true to his own vision, offering this directive to all creative artists: one must be convinced of the infallibility of one's own fantasy, one must believe in one's own creative spirit. Pierrot Lunaire. Pierrot Lunaire, Schoenberg's best-known composition, is an exemplary work of expressionist art. It is a setting for chamber ensemble and female voice of 21 poems by Albert Giroux. Here we meet Pierrot, a white-faced clown from the world of traditional Italian pantomime and puppet shows. Yet in this expressionist poetry, the clown has fallen under the sway of the moon and changed into an alienated modern artist. Pierrot projects his inner anxiety by means of sprechstimme, a vocal technique that requires the vocalist to declaim the text more than to sing it. The voice is to execute the rhythmic values exactly, but once it hits a pitch, it is to quit the tone immediately, sliding away in either a downward or an upward direction. This creates exaggerated declamation of the sort one might hear from a lunatic, which is appropriate for Pierrot, given the lunar spell cast upon him. Expressionism and atonality. Arnold Schoenberg and his students Alban Berg and Anton Webern were not alone in creating a radically new style of art. As we have seen, there appeared at this same time a powerful movement in the visual arts called Expressionism. Expressionism was initially a German-Austrian development that arose in Berlin, Munich, and Vienna. Its aim was not to depict objects as they are seen but to express the strong emotion that the object generated in the artist, not to paint a portrait of an individual but to express the subject's innermost feelings, anxieties, and fears. In Edvard Munch's early expressionist painting The Scream, the subject cries out to an unsympathetic and uncomprehending world. Schoenberg's statement in this regard can be taken as a credo for the entire expressionist movement: art is the cry of despair of those who experience in themselves the fate of all mankind. Gradually, realistic representations gave way to highly personal and increasingly abstract expression. Schoenberg was himself a painter and exhibited his works with the Expressionists in 1912. In fact, the music and art of this movement can be described in rather similar terms. The clashing of strong colors, the disjointed shapes, and the jagged lines of the painters have their counterparts in the harsh dissonances, asymmetrical rhythms, and angular, chromatic melodies of Schoenberg and his followers. It is surely not an accident that Schoenberg moved from tonality to atonality in music at precisely the time that Munch and others turned away from realistic representation to abstract expression. The Scream, by Edvard Munch. 2007. The Munch Museum, the Munch-Ellingson Group, Artists' Rights Society, New York. Photo, Eric Lessing. Art Resource, New York. Download supplementary listening guides for 4 more sections of Pierrot Lunaire, Valse de Chopin, Der Krankmond, Nacht, and Der Mondfleck, at the text website. Poem 6 of Pierrot Lunaire depicts the protagonist's tormented, hallucinatory vision of the suffering Madonna at the cross. Its poetic form is that of a rondo, an ancient musical and poetic form marked by the use of a refrain. Traditionally, composers had used the appearance of a textual refrain to repeat the melody as well, thereby creating musical unity. However, Schoenberg, the iconoclast, repeats the text but not the music. Thus his music unfolds in an ever-varying continuum, like a stream of consciousness. Perhaps not coincidentally, precisely during the years that Schoenberg was creating this music of intense introspection, Sigmund Freud originated the theory of psychoanalysis, also in Vienna. The absence of obvious repetition in Schoenberg's music, nothing is allowed to become familiar, places unprecedented demands on the listener. Your first reaction to the dissonant continuum of sound in Pierrot Lunaire may be decidedly negative. Yet with repeated hearings, the force of the jarring elements of the atonal style begins to lessen, and a bizarre, eerie sort of beauty emerges, especially if you are sensitive to the meaning of the text. Schoenberg's 12-tone music. When Arnold Schoenberg and his followers did away with tonal chord progressions and repeating melodies, they found themselves facing a serious artistic problem: how to write large-scale compositions in the new atonal style. For centuries, musical structures, like fugue and sonata, allegro form, had been generated by means of a clear tonal plan and the repetition of broad musical themes. Repetition created form. But Schoenberg's chromatic, atonal, non-repeating melodies made traditional musical forms all but impossible. What other formal plan might be used? If all 12 notes of the chromatic scale are equally important, as is the case in atonal music, why choose any one note or another at a given moment? By 1923, Schoenberg had solved the problem of formal anarchy, the absence of form caused by total chromatic freedom. He discovered a new way of creating music that he called composing with 12 tones. 12-tone composition is a method of writing that employs each of the 12 notes of the chromatic scale set in a fixed, predetermined order. The composer begins by arranging the 12 notes of the chromatic scale in a sequence of his or her choosing, forming a tone row. Throughout the composition, these 12 notes must come in the same order. Music in which elements such as pitch, timbre, or dynamics come in a fixed series is called serial music. In 12-tone music, the 12-note series may unfold not only as a melody but also as a melody with accompaniment, or simply as a progression of chords, since two or more notes of the row may sound simultaneously. Moreover, in addition to appearing in its basic form, the row might go backward, or upside down, or both backward and upside down at the same time. While such arrangements might seem wholly artificial and very unmusical, we should remember that composers such as Johann Sebastian Bach in the Baroque era and Josquin des Prez in the Renaissance subjected their melodies to similar permutations. The purpose of Schoenberg's 12-tone method was to create musical unity by basing each piece on a single, orderly arrangement of 12 tones, thereby guaranteeing the perfect equality of all pitches so that none would seem like a tonal center. To see a biting satire of Schoenberg's and Berg's 12-tone music, watch 12-tone commercial in the YouTube playlist on the text website. Trio from Suite for Piano. Schoenberg's first steps along this radical 12-tone path were tentative, and the pieces that resulted were very short. Among Schoenberg's first serial compositions was his Suite for Piano, a collection of 7 brief dance movements, including the minuet and trio to be discussed here. The tone row for the suite, along with its 3 permutations, is as follows. Row E, F, G, D, G, E, A, D, B, C, A, B 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Retrograde B, A, C, B, D, A, E, G, D, G, F, E 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 Inversion E, E, D, G, D, F, C, F sharp A, G hashtag B, B 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Retrograde inversion B, B, G hashtag A, F sharp C, F, D, G, D, E, E 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Schoenberg allows the row or any of its permutations to begin on any pitch, so long as the original sequence of intervals is maintained. Notice in the trio, for example, that the row itself begins on E but is also allowed to start on B. In the second part, measures 6, 9, the exact serial progression of the row breaks down slightly. The composer explained this as a justifiable deviation, owing to the need for tonal variety at this point. Notice as well that the rhythms in which the notes appear may likewise be changed for the sake of variety. As you listen to the trio, see if you can follow the unfolding of the row and all its permutations. Listen many times, the piece is only 51 seconds long. Its aesthetic effect is similar to that of a constructivist painting of an artist like Theo van Doesburg. If you like the painting, you might well enjoy Schoenberg's 12-tone piano piece as well. Figure 33, 6. Artist Theo van Doesburg often fashioned designs in retrograde motion, in which the pattern proceeding downward from the top left was the same as that upward from the bottom right. One can simulate the same effect by comparing his rhythms of a Russian dance in upright and rotated orientations. Digital image The Museum of Modern Art licensed by Scala Art Resource, New York. As the years progressed, Schoenberg used his 12-tone method to construct longer compositions for larger forces. By 1932, he had completed most of a full-length opera, Moses and Aaron, and in 1947, he finished a long cantata, A Survivor from Warsaw, that tells of Nazi atrocities in Poland. Both works are in the 12-tone style throughout. But the listening public never fully embraced 12-tone music. The style is as inaccessible as Schoenberg's earlier atonal music. For most listeners, it sounds irrational and arbitrary, completely out of control. Indeed, the 12-tone system has been called one of the 2 great failed experiments of the 20th century, the other being communism. Schoenberg was philosophical about the public's general dislike of his music. If it is art, it is not for all, and if it is for all, it is not art. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may watch Craig Wright's own lecture at Open Yale Courses and complete this chapter's listening exercise interactively, as well as view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words: Impresario, neoclassicism, polymeter, polyrhythm, polychord. Second Viennese School, atonal music, expressionism, Sprechstim, 12-tone composition, serial music. Russian and Eastern European modernism. 34. We naturally tend to assume that Western civilization has been shaped primarily by those events that took place in the West itself. In the early 20th century, however, several events of great importance to Western history occurred in Russia and Eastern Europe. In 1917, the West was shaken by the Russian Revolution, the overthrow of the Russian Tsar by the Socialist Bolshevik Party. This turn of events paved the way for the establishment of a communist-ruled Soviet Union in 1922, a development that led ultimately to the Cold War, which dominated Western foreign policy concerns for decades. We likewise tend to credit the military powers of the West with the defeat of Adolf Hitler and his Nazi regime in the Second World War. But while Western soldiers unquestionably played a vital role, the bulk of the fighting took place on the Russian front. Apart from combat in the Pacific, fully 80% of soldiers killed in World War II died on the Russian front, about 11 million Russians and 5 million Germans. Civilian casualties in the East likewise outnumbered those in the West. The number of civilian dead in Russia, victims of war, famine, and government purges, is estimated between 30 and 40 million. These horrors affected all segments of society, including artists, intellectuals, and musicians. Indeed, it is no exaggeration to say that the three composers discussed in this chapter had their lives ruined by the cataclysmic events that rocked Russia and Eastern Europe in these decades. We begin with Russia. Figure 34, 1. Western Russia and Central and Eastern Europe, early 20th century. Progressive artists who worked in the Soviet Union during the dictatorship of Joseph Stalin did so under conditions that are incomprehensible today. During the 1920s and 1930s, the ruling Communist Party forcefully confiscated the wealth of the well-to-do and redistributed it collectively among the proletariat. Anything that smacked of elitism, anything that could not be immediately understood and enjoyed by the masses, was suspect. Heading the list of likely subversives were the names of almost all modern artists, including composers, and especially those who wrote in the atonal or 12-tone style. The Soviet regime encouraged patriotic compositions, in which large choruses sang hymns of praise to the fatherland and to the working class, pieces to promote communist propaganda. Soviet authorities referred to modern music as formalism and branded it anti-democratic. To be identified as a formalist was tantamount to a death sentence. The challenge for a composer working under Stalin was to remain true to a personal artistic vision, yet remain alive. Sergei Prokofiev. The career of Sergei Prokofiev is full of contradictions and ironies, caused in part by the place he occupied in Russian history. The son of a well-to-do farm administrator, he fled the Russian Revolution in 1917 but later returned to celebrate in music the most murderous of the revolutionaries, Joseph Stalin. Prokofiev was once known as the dissonant, atonal, bad boy of the St. Petersburg Conservatory, where he received his musical education, but he later wrote such pleasantly benign works as Peter and the Wolf. He thought of himself above all as a serious composer, the author of 7 symphonies, 6 operas, 6 ballets, 5 piano concertos, and 9 piano sonatas. Today, however, he is remembered mainly for his lighter works, the classical symphony, Peter and the Wolf, and the film scores Lieutenant Kij and Alexander Nevsky. The Russian Revolution has been called the 10 days that shook the world, and it certainly shook Prokofiev's world. With his family's wealth about to be confiscated, he took the Trans-Siberian Express eastward toward Japan and ultimately landed in San Francisco. After 4 years as a composer-pianist in America, the vagabond Prokofiev moved to Paris, where for a time he worked as a ballet composer for Sergei Diaghilev and his ballets Russes. But his career languished. Eager to have illustrious expatriates return to the Soviet Union and working through his secret police in Paris, dictator Joseph Stalin lured Prokofiev back home with the promise that a simpler, less dissonant musical style would bring both popular success and governmental approval. Romeo and Juliet. Prokofiev's first official work as a Soviet composer was the ballet Romeo and Juliet, which he wrote for the famous Kirov Ballet of St. Petersburg during the summer of 1935. To conform to a Soviet artistic dictate of the day, the composer penned a happy conclusion. Before the work could be staged, however, a reign of cultural terror fell upon all Soviet artists in 1936, and Prokofiev withdrew the work. Not until 5 years later, in 1940, did the composer feel that the political environment was safe enough to allow the work to be performed. What could possibly be controversial about Romeo and Juliet? Not the age-old story, nor the idea of romance, but rather Prokofiev's musical style. Prokofiev had been a dissonant and occasionally atonal composer before his return to the Soviet Union. Now his task was to meld his modernist tendencies with the required simple, melodious music the government demanded. As we listen to the ball scene from Romeo and Juliet, we can hear this modernist populist dialectic at work. For a courtly dance, we would expect pleasant music. What we get is pleasing but not quite pleasant. The initial music is dark, somewhat disjunct melodically, and unstable tonally, sliding from one unexpected chord to another. Yet it has power and energy. We feel ourselves swaying to the beat of the regular, duple-meter bass line. As the corps de ballet exits to allow a pas de deux, the music becomes softer, and the melody is strangely beautiful, owing to its slightly dissonant cast. Everywhere there is just enough hard edge and bite to Prokofiev's music to prevent this sentimental story from becoming sappy or kitschy. Sentimentality had no place in the modernist aesthetic. Had you been General Secretary of the Communist Party at this time, would you have banned the music you just heard because its modernist sounds might cause social unrest? In fact, performances of Prokofiev's music were officially outlawed in 1948. That same year, his wife, Lena, was arrested by the secret police for espionage and sentenced to an exile of 20 years. With Prokofiev in ill health, his output dwindled to nothing. He died within a few minutes of his nemesis, Joseph Stalin, on the night of March 5, 1953. Yet news of Prokofiev's death was withheld for days so as not to deflect attention from the deceased dictator. No flowers could be bought for the great composer's coffin. The funeral of Stalin had, without exaggeration, claimed them all. Dmitri Shostakovich. Prokofiev was not the only composer to suffer during Stalin's reign of terror. Dmitri Shostakovich, a few years Prokofiev's junior, experienced even greater trauma. Born to a musical family, Shostakovich showed exceptional promise from an early age. He had perfect pitch and could play through all of Bach's well-tempered clavier by age 11. In 1919, he entered the St. Petersburg Conservatory, where he studied harmony, orchestration, and composition. After mixed results in his courses at the conservatory, Shostakovich achieved his first major success in 1925 with the completion and performance of his Symphony No. 1, which earned the composer international acclaim at the age of 19. In 1934, Shostakovich attracted widespread attention once again with his realistic opera Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk district. But in 1936, his career prospects took a disastrous turn when Stalin attended a performance of his opera but walked out 3/4 of the way through. 2 days later, Shostakovich's music was denounced in the official Soviet newspaper Pravda in an article titled "Chaos Instead of Music." As the composer later said, "I'll never forget that day, the bitterness that has colored my life gray." Figure 34-2. Dmitri Shostakovich. Lebrecht Music and Arts. Figure 34-3. Shostakovich, the poster boy for Russian resistance to German aggression, as presented to Americans in 1941. Lebrecht Music and Arts. Throughout his career, Shostakovich's relationship with the Soviet government was complex and ever-changing. During the 1930s and 1940s, he was the most popular composer of Russian high art music. his symphonies were played not only at home but also throughout Europe and in the major cities of the United States and Canada. This international stature gave him a measure of protection. It was difficult for Stalin to exile such a public figure to a work camp, or to execute him, as he did other intellectuals. Indeed, in some years, Shostakovich was in favor. In 1941, he won the Stalin Medal for service to the state and served as a poster boy for the spirit of Russian resistance in the war with Hitler's Germany. But twice, in 1936 and 1948, his music was officially denounced as formalistic. After each condemnation, Shostakovich hid his most progressive scores and toned down the modernist component in the little music that he did allow to be performed. This game of cat and mouse, with Shostakovich as the mouse, continued until the composer died from a heart attack in 1975. Symphony No. 5. In his Symphony No. 5, written the year following his first denunciation at the hands of the Soviet authorities, Shostakovich felt compelled to keep his modernist tendencies largely hidden from view. The work was a huge success when it premiered in November 1937. Here was music that the average listener, Stalin, for example, could understand. In spirit, Symphony No. 5 resembles the symphonies of Gustav Mahler, with their brilliant orchestrations and expressive, emotional character. Yet Shostakovich was fully a citizen of the 20th century, intent on speaking with a fully modern voice. Here, while the progressive voice is, of necessity, somewhat muted, it can still be heard in the heavy percussion, moderate dissonance, ostinatos, and sliding harmonies of the sort found in Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet. Shostakovich would go on to compose 10 more symphonies. While many of these are often performed today, the fifth remains his most popular. The exultant finale seems to signal the ultimate triumph of the human spirit. Yet in light of the circumstances under which it was written, critics still ask, was the rejoicing expressed here truly felt, or was it feigned, forced from the composer? Shostakovich himself suggested the answer when he said, "The majority of my symphonies are tombstones." To take listening exercise 40 for this musical selection online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. Béla Bartók. The music of the Hungarian composer Béla Bartók is decidedly modern, yet distinctly different in sound from that of Stravinsky or Schönberg. While it can be atonal, like the music of Schönberg, it is often highly tuneful, making use of sweeping melodies. And while it is frequently percussive and highly rhythmic, like the motor-driven sounds of Stravinsky, Bartók's rhythmic force derives mainly from folk music. Bartók's creative imagination was fired by folk materials of his native Hungary. He saw the return to the simple, direct style of folk music as a way to counter the tendency in romantic music toward ostentation and sentimentality. Figure 34-4. Béla Bartók. Betman Corbis. The life of Béla Bartók was strongly affected by the turbulent events that occurred in Eastern Europe during the first half of the 20th century. He was born in 1881 in Hungary, but in a part of that nation that was later given over to Romania at the end of World War I. Throughout his life, he was an ardent Hungarian nationalist, and he chose to develop his obvious musical talents at the Academy of Music in Budapest rather than at the German-dominated Vienna Conservatory, to which he had also been admitted. As a student at the Academy in Budapest, he studied composition and piano, quickly acquiring a reputation as a concert pianist of the highest quality. By the 1920s, he had achieved an international reputation both as a pianist and as a composer of modernist music. His tours even carried him to the west coast of the United States, where a local newspaper alerted the public to his coming with the following headline, "Hungarian Modernist Advances upon Los Angeles." As both a Hungarian modernist and nationalist, Bartók was an outspoken critic of the supporters of Nazi Germany who gained control of the Hungarian government. In the late 1930s, he called the fascists bandits and assassins, cut off ties with the German firm that published his music, and banned the performances of his works in Germany and Italy, thereby losing considerable performance and broadcast fees. Ultimately, in 1940, he fled to the United States. Figure 34-5. Bela Bartok recording folk songs among Czech-speaking peasants in 1908. The performers sang into the megaphone of a wax cylinder recording machine invented by Thomas Edison. Copyright The Art Archive Bela Bartok House, Budapest Alfredo Dagli Ordi. Bela Bartok is rare among composers in that he was as much interested in musical research, specifically, in the study of Eastern European folk music, as in musical composition. He traveled from village to village in Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and even North Africa using the newly invented recording machine of Thomas Edison. In this way, his ear became saturated with the driving rhythms and odd-numbered meters of peasant dances, as well as the unusual scales on which the folk melodies of Eastern Europe were constructed. The musical heritage of Eastern Europe is heard throughout Bartok's music, from his first string quartet to his great final works for orchestra, music for strings, percussion and celesta, divertimento for strings, and concerto for orchestra. This last-named piece was commissioned by the conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra for the then substantial fee of $1,000. It remains Bartok's best-known and most alluring composition. Download a supplementary listening guide for the third movement of Bartok's music for strings, percussion and celesta, at the text website. Concerto for orchestra. Normally, concertos are written for a single solo instrument, piano or violin, for example, pitted against an orchestra. In Bartok's Concerto for Orchestra, however, the composer encourages many instruments to step forward from within the orchestra to serve as soloists from time to time. The spotlight switches from one instrument to another or to a new combination of instruments, each displaying its distinctive tonal color against the backdrop of the full orchestra. There are 5 movements. The first is written in a more or less regular sonata form, as the composer says, and makes use of the folk-like pentatonic scale. The second is a colorful parade of pairs of instruments. The third is an atmospheric nocturne, an example of what is called Bartok's night music, in which the woodwinds slither around chromatically above a misty tremolo in the strings. The fourth is an unusual intermezzo, and the fifth is a vigorous peasant dance in sonata, allegro form. Let us focus our attention on the fourth movement, intermezzo interato. An intermezzo is a light musical interlude intended to separate and thus break the mood of 2 more serious surrounding movements. But here, as the title Broken Intermezzo indicates, the light intermezzo is itself rudely interrupted by contrasting music. At the outset of the movement, a charming theme in the oboe establishes a sophisticated mood. As is usual for Bartok, this melody shows the influence of the Hungarian folk song both in its pentatonic construction and in the way the meter switches back and forth between an even and an odd. As we have seen, the pentatonic scale and irregular meters are marks of the folk. Example 34, 1. After the tune is passed among several wind instruments, an even more ingratiating melody emerges in the strings. It, too, is Hungarian in style. In fact, it is Bartok's idealized reworking of the song You Are Lovely, You Are Beautiful, Hungary. Example 34, 2. But the nostalgic vision of the homeland is suddenly interrupted by a new, cruder theme in the clarinet, and it also tells a tale. Bartok had just heard Dmitri Shostakovich's Symphony No. 7, composed in 1942 as a programmatic work designed to stiffen Russian resistance to the German army, which had invaded the previous year. Shostakovich was a Russian hero at that moment, and Bartok borrowed the theme that Shostakovich had written to signify the invading Germans, believing its simple quarter-note descent to be appropriately heavy and trite. Download a supplementary listening guide for the second movement of Bartok's Concerto for Orchestra, at the text website. Example 34, 3. Thus Bartok's Broken Intermezzo can be heard as an autobiographical work in which, as the composer related to a friend, the artist declares his love for his native land in a serenade which is suddenly interrupted in a crude and violent manner. He is seized by rough, booted men who even break his instrument. Bartok tells us what he thinks of these rough, booted men by surrounding them with rude, jeering noises in the trumpets and sneering trombone glissandos. Ultimately, he brings back the idyllic vision of the homeland by returning to the 2 opening themes. As to the soloists in this movement of Bartók's concerto for orchestra, there are many: oboe, clarinet, flute, English horn, and the entire section of violas. As was true for Prokofiev and Shostakovich, Bartók's last years were not golden. He arrived in New York in 1940 as a refugee from Nazi-dominated Europe and tried to patch together a living by performing and composing. But, aside from his concerto for orchestra, he had little success and ultimately died of leukemia in New York's West Side Hospital in 1945, a sad ending in an era that brought disillusionment, turmoil, and death to millions. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may complete this chapter's listening exercise interactively, as well as view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words: Russian Revolution Formalism Intermezzo. 35.3 American Voices. The United States is a highly pluralistic society, home to recent and not-so-recent immigrants, as well as Native Americans. This cultural and ethnic diversity is reflected in the country's many popular musical traditions including blues, ragtime, jazz, rock and roll, traditional Appalachian, bluegrass, and country and western. American art music of the past 100 years was equally variegated, exemplified by high art modernist music of the European type, modernism with a distinctly American flavor, and, most recently, postmodernist music. Unlike the suppressed European composers discussed in Chapter 34, 20th-century American composers were free to create without governmental constraints. Offering both a free market for the exchange of artistic ideas and a safe homeland for ethnic groups from around the globe, the United States has come to enjoy the most diverse and vibrant musical culture in the world. In this chapter, we explore how three composers of high art music added their very different voices to the diverse chorus of American music. Charles Ives. Charles Ives was the most original and most radical, and arguably the greatest, of the American composers of art music. He was born in Danbury, Connecticut, the son of George Ives, a band leader in the Union Army who had served with General Ulysses S. Grant during the Civil War. The senior Ives gave his son a highly unorthodox musical education, at least by European standards. True, there was the obligatory study of the 3 B's, instruction in harmony and counterpoint, and lessons on the violin, piano, organ, cornet, and drums. But young Ives was also taught how to stretch his ears, as he said. In one exercise, for example, he was made to sing Swanee River in E while his father accompanied him on the piano in the key of C, a useful lesson in polytonality. Figure 35, 1. Young Charles Ives in the baseball uniform of Hopkins Grammar School, New Haven, Connecticut. A better ballplayer than student, Ives needed an extra year between high school and college to prepare for Yale. Lebrick Music and Arts. Because his forebears had gone to Yale, it was decided that Charles should enroll there, too. At Yale, he took courses in music with Horatio Parker, a composer who had studied in Germany. But Ives's youthful, independent ideas about how music should sound clashed with Parker's traditional European training in harmony and counterpoint. The student learned to leave his more radical musical experimentations, which included, for example, a fugue with a subject entering in 4 different keys, outside Parker's classroom. Ives became heavily involved in extracurricular activities, including musicals for the Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity, and maintained a D+ average. When he graduated in 1898, Ives decided not to pursue music as a profession, realizing that the sort of music he heard in his head was not the kind the public would pay to hear. Instead, he headed for New York City and Wall Street, and in 1907, he and a friend formed the Company of Ives and Myrick, an agency that sold insurance as a subsidiary of Mutual of New York. Ives and Myrick became the largest insurance agency in the United States, and in 1929, the year in which Ives retired, the company had sales of $49 million. But Charles Ives led 2 lives, high-powered insurance executive by day, prolific composer by night. During the 20 years between his departure from Yale and the American entry into World War I, Ives wrote the bulk of his 43 works for orchestra, 41 choral pieces, approximately 75 works for piano solo or various chamber ensembles, and more than 150 songs. Almost without exception, they went unheard. Ives made little effort to get his music performed. Composition was for him a very private matter. By the 1930s, however, word of his unusual creations had spread among a few influential performers and critics. In 1947, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in Music for his Third Symphony, one he had written 40 years earlier. In his typically gruff, eccentric way, Ives told the members of the Pulitzer Committee, "Prizes are for boys. I'm grown up." Download supplementary listening guides for Ives, variations on America, the 4th of July, and Orchestral Set No. 2, Third Movement, at the text website. Ives's music. Charles Ives was an idiosyncratic, quirky man, and his music is unlike that of any other composer. Ives was a modernist of the most extreme sort. Between 1898 and 1917, he independently devised the same radical compositional techniques, including atonality, polymeter, polyrhythm, and tone clusters, that had begun to appear in the works of Schoenberg, Stravinsky, and the other European modernists. Moreover, Ives was the first composer to use polytonality extensively, and he even experimented with quarter-tone music, music in which the smallest interval is not the chromatic half-step but half of a half-step. Ives's music places great demands on performer and listener alike. It is full of ear-splitting dissonances and dense, complex textures. At the same time, however, it contains many simple, popular musical elements, incorporating patriotic songs, marches, hymns, dance tunes, fiddle tunes, rags, and football cheers. This was Ives's musical America. Ives often combines these familiar musical idioms with melodies of his own, piling one tune on top of another to form a new composite. What results is a jarring kind of collage art made up of disparate materials taken from very different places. In a manner akin to that of an avant-garde artist who reinterprets fragments of reality in surprising ways, Ives takes the familiar and defamiliarizes it, thereby making the old sound very modern. Figure 35, 2. William Harnet's music and the old cupboard door creates a satisfying collage of Americana by melding various objects from a closet and the world of music. Copyright Museums Sheffy ELD, UK The Bridgeman Art Library. Putnam's Camp, Reading, Connecticut from 3 places in New England. Although he made a fortune in the financial world of Wall Street, Charles Ives was born and died a New Englander. Shortly after his marriage in 1908, he began to compose what he always referred to as his New England Symphony, though today we call this 3-movement programmatic orchestral work 3 places in New England. The first movement pays homage to an all-black Civil War regiment honored in a sculptured monument then on Boston Common, while the third movement depicts a walk on a misty morning in the Berkshire Mountains in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. The middle movement, Putnam's Camp, evokes childhood memories of a 4th of July picnic on the town green in Reading, Connecticut, near Ives's ancestral home. Ives wrote his own narrative program for the movement, and in it, he suggests that this is music as seen through the eyes of a child, perhaps the recollections of Ives himself. At first, the boy recalls the games, bands, and singing on Independence Day, but he soon falls asleep and dreams about the American colonial soldiers in the army of General Israel Putnam, who wintered at Reading during 1778-1779. Reawakening, he again hears the colorful, cacophonous sounds of a small-town 4th of July. A dream might be termed a collage of the mind, in which familiar persons and things appear juxtaposed with one another in haphazard sequence. Putnam's Camp sounds like a musical dream. Tune fragments from many historical periods seem to appear at random. Some of the marches, including Yankee Doodle and the British Grenadiers, date, appropriately, from Revolutionary times, but The Star-Spangled Banner and Stephen Foster's Masses into Cold Ground were composed much later. In this piece, Ives shows music to be a particularly effective art in which to reassemble random bits of sonic information, in much the same manner that a dream reassembles random bits of personal experience. Ives's musical dream is a bracing, sometimes shocking vision brought about by musical distortion. For example, the composer typically takes a familiar tune and alters the pitches chromatically or changes the rhythm, usually by syncopation. Notice in example 35:1 how he modifies the tune, the British Grenadiers, thereby making the familiar unfamiliar. Example 35:1. But most jarring is Ives's use of polytonality, the simultaneous sounding of two or more keys. Example 35:2 shows how Ives combines the distorted version of the British Grenadiers with his own march tune, presenting the first in the key of E major and the second in the key of C major. Such tonal clashes add a further element of aural disjunction, making the tunes seem out of phase with each other. Example 35:2. Most polytonality is simultaneous, but Ives also employs polytonality in linear fashion, taking a standard tune and presenting each successive phrase in a different key, as he does with Yankee Doodle. Example 35:3. The following listening guide has been prepared with the aid of Ives scholar James Sinclair, whose edition of Putnam's Camp, based upon Ives's manuscripts at Yale University, was used in the present recording. The guide attempts to identify the welter of tune fragments Ives drew from his memory of musical America, but even with it and a synopsis of Ives's own narrative program, Putnam's Camp remains a challenging piece. Despite the difficulties, Ives wanted this movement to be fun. As he said to encourage the conductor and instrumentalists prior to a performance in 1931, the concert will go all right. Just kick into the music, never mind the exact notes or the right notes, they're always a nuisance. Aaron Copland. Composers working in Europe in the 19th century sought to establish national styles of art music, as if to shout out in sound, "We exist. We matter." Similarly, in the early 20th century, the challenge for composers in the United States was to provide this emerging nation with its own distinctive musical identity, to fashion compositions that sounded truly American rather than European. Charles Ives did this within his own unique musical world, one full of American marches, patriotic songs, and hymn tunes. Aaron Copland did much the same, drawing also on cowboy songs and early jazz. But Copland, in contrast to his older contemporary Ives, set his bits of Americana not within a collage of dissonant polytonality, but instead in a conservative backdrop of generally consonant harmony. Figure 35:3. Aaron Copland. AP Images Martel. Copland was born in Brooklyn of Jewish immigrant parents. After a rudimentary musical education in New York City, he set sail for Paris to broaden his artistic horizons. In this he was not alone, for the City of Light at this time attracted young writers, painters, and musicians from across the world, including Igor Stravinsky, Pablo Picasso, James Joyce, Gertrude Stein, Ernest Hemingway, N.F. Scott Fitzgerald. After 3 years of study, Copland returned to the United States, determined to compose in a distinctly American style. Like other young expatriate artists during the 1920s, Copland had to leave his homeland to learn what made it unique. In greater or lesser degree, he remarked, "All of us discovered America in Europe." At first, Copland sought to forge an American style by incorporating into his music elements of jazz, recognized the world over as a uniquely American creation. Then, beginning in the late 1930s, Copland turned his attention to a series of projects with rural and Western American subjects. The ballet scores Billy the Kid and Rodeo are set in the West and make use of classic cowboy songs like Goodbye, Old Paint, and the Old Chisholm Trail. Another ballet, Appalachian Spring, recreates the ambience of the Pennsylvania farm country, and his only opera, The Tender Land, is set in the Corn Belt of the Midwest. It is telling that filmmaker Spike Lee used Copland's music to fashion the soundtrack for his basketball movie He Got Game. In the minds of some, the Copland sound is as American as basketball. Download a supplementary listening guide for Scene 1 from Copland's Billy the Kid at the text website. Copland's music. In his most distinctly American works, Copland's musical voice is clear and conservative. He uses folk and popular elements to soften the dissonant harmonies and disjunct melodies of European modernism. Copland's melodies tend to be more stepwise and diatonic than those of other 20th-century composers, perhaps because Western folk and popular tunes are fundamentally conjunct and non-chromatic. His harmonies are almost always tonal and often slow-moving in a way that can evoke the vastness and grandeur of the American landscape. The triad, too, is still important to Copland, perhaps for its stability and simplicity, but he frequently uses it in a modern way, as we shall see, by having two triads sound simultaneously, creating mildly dissonant polychords. But perhaps the most important component